I have told this story exactly twice in the years since. Once to my wife, on the night it happened, when I could not stop my hands from shaking long enough to set down a cup of tea. And once, much later, to my own son, when he was old enough to ask why his great-grandfather's medals sat in a glass case by our door, and why every autumn the old man insisted on going back to the same cold square in front of the same gray palace to stand among men who got fewer each year. This is the second telling, written down so it does not depend on my memory alone, because I have learned that memory is a poor keeper of the things that matter most. It smooths them. It rounds the edges of what was sharp. And the thing I want to keep is sharp. It is the picture of a man who did not move for almost an hour while the whole world tried to make him move, and then moved once, at the only moment that counted, and saved my grandfather's life without ever raising his voice. My grandfather was Bram Castor. To me, he was simply Granda, an old man who smelled of pipe smoke and shoe polish, and who could not climb the stairs of our house any more without stopping twice to rest. But once, long before I was born, in a war that the kingdom of Lindharo no longer quite knew how to talk about, he had been a sergeant in the king's foot guard. He had stood a post the way men of his generation stood posts, which is to say for hours in any weather, until his feet went numb and his back locked, and the only proof he was still alive was the slow fog of his own breath. He had buried friends. He had carried 2 men out of a place I was never told the name of, one over each shoulder, and only one of them had still been breathing by the time he reached the line. He never told me that. My grandmother told me once when she thought I was old enough, and then she made me promise not to mention it to him, because he did not like it spoken of. Every year on the Day of the Fallen, Granda put on his old coat. It was the faded green of the foot guard, the color long since gone soft, the brass buttons polished so often over so many decades that the king's crest stamped into them had nearly worn away. He pinned his medals to the breast himself, with fingers that trembled now and could not always find the holes. And he went to Castlewood, to the eastern forecourt, to stand with the others while a wreath was laid at the foot of the old stone memorial that the kingdom kept there, and a single bell was rung, and the names of the regiments that no longer existed were read aloud into the cold. That year my grandmother was 3 years in her grave, and my grandfather could no longer go alone, so I went with him. I was 31, recently married, impatient in the way that men are impatient when they are young and healthy, and have not yet learned what a privilege those 2 things are. I want to be honest about who I was that morning, because it makes the rest of it mean more. I did not want to be there. I loved my grandfather, but I did not understand him, and I thought the ceremony was a long cold standing around for the sake of men who were mostly gone, and a king most of us would never see. I drove him to the city. I parked too far away because everything near the palace was closed off, and I half carried him the last quarter-mile through streets that grew thicker with people the closer we came. By the time we reached the square, the crowd was very large. The eastern forecourt of Castlewood is a great open apron of pale stone in front of the palace's main gate, the King's Gate, an enormous structure of black iron and gilded spikes set between 2 towers. On an ordinary day, tourists press their faces to the bars and take photographs of the guardsmen who stand their posts in the forecourt beyond. But on the Day of the Fallen, the forecourt is given over to the ceremony. The public is held back behind a low cordon of rope and barrier, and the space within is kept for the old soldiers, the families of the dead, the clergy, and whatever member of the royal house has been chosen to lay the wreath that year. There were thousands of us, I think. The morning was very bright and very cold, the kind of autumn light that has no warmth in it at all, that lies on stone like frost, and the breath of the crowd rose up in a thin haze over our heads. I got Granda to his place. The veterans were given chairs near the front, close to the memorial, a long double row of folding seats set out on the stone, and an attendant in palace livery checked his name against a list and led him to one. I stood behind him at the edge of where the families were allowed, close enough to reach him if he needed me. He sat very straight. He always sat very straight, even when it visibly cost him. He folded his trembling hands in his lap, and he looked at the gate, and his face took on an expression I had seen only on this one day each year, a kind of stillness that I did not have a word for then, and would not have a word for until the end of that afternoon. And there, beyond the cordon, beyond the rope, inside the forecourt at the foot of the gate, stood the guard. I want to describe him as he was, because I looked at him for a long time before anything happened, and at the start I looked at him the way the tourists do, which is to say as a curiosity rather than a man. He stood at the inner edge of the forecourt, near the base of the right-hand gate tower, at a post that put him a little apart from the small detail of his fellow guardsmen and gave him a clear line down the length of the cordon. He wore the full ceremonial dress of the king's foot guard, a long coat of deep scarlet wool, brushed flawless, the brass buttons in their 2 bright rows catching the hard sun. A tall black bearskin cap that made him seem inhumanly large, its chinstrap a thin line across the lower half of his face, white gloves, spotless, a row of metal ribbons across his breast, and below them, where the wool was darker from the press of it, the worn place where a rifle had rested 10,000 times. He held that rifle now, grounded the butt of it on the stone beside his boot, his white-gloved hand resting on the muzzle. He looked straight ahead. He did not move. He did not move, and I mean that with a completeness that is difficult to convey to anyone who has not stood and watched it. The crowd shifted and murmured and coughed and rearranged itself. Children were lifted onto shoulders. A man near me kept clearing his throat. The flags above the gate snapped and went slack and snapped again in the cold wind, and through all of it the guardsman was as fixed as the stone he stood on. His chest rose and fell, slow, and that was the only proof he was alive. His eyes, what I could see of them under the shadow of the bearskin, were level and forward, and gave away nothing at all. I remember thinking, with the casual disrespect of a young man who has never been tested, that it must be the easiest hard job in the world. To stand, to do nothing, to let the day go by while better men sat in chairs and remembered the dead. I remember thinking, God help me, that there was something a little absurd about him, this enormous scarlet statue, this relic of a kind of soldiering that machines and money had surely made obsolete. I remember being, in my heart, very slightly contemptuous of him. I have had a long time to be ashamed of that. The ceremony began. A bell somewhere high in the palace rang once, a single deep note that rolled out over the forecourt and silenced the crowd by degrees, the murmur dying back from the front toward the rear like a wave pulling off a beach. A clergyman in white came out and spoke words I do not remember. Then an old officer, very straight, his own coat heavy with the weight of a lifetime, read out the names of the regiments. He read them slowly. The 3rd Foot, the Border Horse, the Lintherow Fusiliers. The names of units that no longer existed, that had been folded and renamed and disbanded across a century of the kingdom forgetting its own wars. And as each one was read, I felt, rather than saw, the old men in the chairs in front of me straighten a little more, each at the name that was his. When the old officer read the King's Foot Guard, my grandfather's regiment, I saw Granda's trembling hands go still in his lap, just for a moment, as if the name had reached into him and held him steady. And it was while I was looking at my grandfather, at the back of his white head and the worn green of his old coat, that I first noticed the man. I could not have told you at that moment why I noticed him. I have thought about it many times since, and I believe it was nothing more than this, that everyone else in the great crowd was still and he was not. The whole press of people, thousands of us, had settled into the particular stillness of a remembrance, the bowed heads, the folded hands, the held breath. And down the length of the cordon, off to my left, perhaps 40 feet away, one man was moving. He moved slowly. He was not pushing, not shoving, nothing that would draw a shout. He was simply, gently, patiently working his way forward through the packed bodies toward the front, toward the rope, toward the place where the cordon turned a corner and the veterans' chairs began. He had a way of slipping into the small gaps between people, a hand on a shoulder here, a murmured word there, the manner of a man who is only trying to find his family or get a better view. In any ordinary crowd he would have been invisible. I would never have seen him. but against the stillness of that one, he stood out to me like a single moving figure in a painting of statues. He was perhaps 40. He wore a dark coat buttoned to the throat and a flat cap, and he did not look like a mourner. I cannot tell you exactly what I mean by that, except that the mourners were all turned inward, sunk into their own remembering, and he was turned outward. His head moved. His eyes moved. He was looking at the gate and at the chairs and at the guardsmen, the way you might look at a room you meant to walk into, measuring it. And one of his hands stayed always at the front of his coat, over the buttons, holding the fabric closed against the wind, except that the wind was at his back. I looked at him for a moment, and then I looked away, because I was 31 and I did not yet know that the small wrong thing is almost always the whole story, and I told myself he was nobody, a latecomer, a man looking for his wife. I looked back at my grandfather. The old officer was still reading names. And when I looked up again toward the gate, toward the scarlet statue at his post, I saw the thing that changed the whole shape of that afternoon for me, and changed, I think, the whole shape of how I have lived since. The guardsman was looking at the man. Nothing else about him had moved. His body was as fixed as ever, the rifle grounded, the white glove on the muzzle, the bearskin level, the chest rising and falling slow. But his eyes had come off the middle distance, off the safe forward stare, and they had found the man in the dark coat, and they were following him. I do not know how to make you feel what that did to me. I had been watching the guardsman for the better part of an hour, and I had decided he was an ornament, a thing that did not see and did not think and only stood. And now, in an instant, I understood that I had been wrong about him in a way that frightened me. He was not blind. He was not asleep behind that still face. He was the most awake thing in that entire square. He had seen what I had half seen and dismissed, and he had not dismissed it. Behind the discipline that held his body utterly still, his mind was working, fast and cold and certain, on the one moving man in a crowd of the motionless. And he did nothing. That was the next thing I learned, and it was almost harder to bear than the first, because every instinct in me, now that I was alarmed, was screaming for him to act, to shout, to point, to call out, to break ranks, to send the other guardsmen down the line, to do something. The man in the dark coat was 40 feet from the chairs and closing. My grandfather was in the second row of those chairs. And the guardsman, who saw all of it, who had seen it before I did, simply stood there and watched and let the man come. I did not understand it then. I understand it now, and I will try to set it down plainly, because it is the heart of everything. He could not move. Not yet. Think about what he was and where he stood. He was one man at a post in front of 100 cameras and 10,000 people, at a ceremony of state, with the royal house due to appear at any moment, the eyes of the whole kingdom on that forecourt. If he broke his post and crossed the cordon and laid hands on a stranger in the crowd, and that stranger turned out to be a grieving man looking for his seat, the cost would be enormous. A panic in a packed square can kill more people than any single villain ever could. A scarlet guardsman charging into a crowd of mourners on the day of the fallen wrong would be a disaster that no apology could undo. He knew that. He knew it better than I, who had never carried any weight heavier than my own comfort, could have begun to know it. So he held. He waited. He kept his post, and he kept his stillness, and he watched the man come, and he did the hardest thing a disciplined man can do, which is nothing, for as long as nothing was the right thing, while his certainty grew toward the single instant when it would no longer be. I have tried since to imagine what that hour cost him, though it was only minutes. To see the wrong thing, to know it for what it is, to feel the danger of it walking closer to the people you have sworn to stand for, and to make yourself wait and wait and wait, because acting too soon would be its own kind of failure. I do not think I could do it. I think I would have shouted. I think most men would have shouted, and in the shouting made everything worse. The man in the dark coat reached the corner of the cordon, where the rope turned and the veterans' chairs began, and he stopped. He stood at the rope, perhaps 20 feet now from the front row, and he looked over it into the kept space, at the old men in their chairs and the memorial beyond and the gate beyond that, and his hand was still at the front of his coat. I looked at my grandfather. I have to tell you about my grandfather now, because while all of this was happening to me, something was happening to him, and I did not see it until later when I pieced the afternoon back together. Granda had served. Granda had stood posts and watched crowds and known, in a war I was never told the shape of, what it was to feel the small wrong thing before you could name it. The instincts that the guardsman had, the old man had once had too, and they do not entirely leave a soldier, not even when his hands shake and his legs will not carry him up the stairs. I learned afterward from a thing he said to me that evening that he had felt it as well. That sometime in those minutes, sunk in his chair among the names of the dead, the old soldier in him had woken, and his neck had prickled and he had turned his head, slow, the way an old dog turns its head at a sound below the range of younger ears, and he had looked at the man in the dark coat, and he had known. He did not cry out either. He could not have. He had no breath for it and no strength. But I have wondered ever since whether some part of the thing that passed in the next few seconds passed between those two men, the old guardsman in the chair and the young one at the gate, across 20 feet of cold stone in a language that I do not speak and never will. A recognition. The old one telling the young one with nothing but the turn of his head and the set of his face, yes, you see it too. I am not wrong, neither are you. The royal procession appeared. A door opened in the base of the gate tower, and out came the small party that would lay the wreath. I will not pretend I remember exactly who they were, beyond that there was an elderly member of the royal house, very upright, white-haired, in a dark coat with a single chain of office, and an attendant or two, and the old officer who had read the names falling in beside them. They came out into the cold and turned toward the memorial, and the whole crowd's attention went to them. Every head, every eye, every camera in 10,000 hands, swinging toward the small upright figure walking slowly toward the wreath. Every eye but two. The guardsman's eyes did not go to the royal party, and my grandfather's did not either. And the man in the dark coat at the corner of the cordon, who had been waiting, I think, for exactly this, for the moment when the whole world would be looking the other way, took his hand from the front of his coat and put it inside. I want to be careful here because I do not fully know, even now, what he carried. The kingdom never said, not plainly, and I have come to believe that the not saying was deliberate, that there are things best kept out of the papers so that no other troubled man reads them and finds in them a pattern to follow. I know only what I saw, which was a man take from inside his dark coat something that he had kept hidden there through all that long patient crossing of the crowd, and begin to bring it out, and begin to step over the low rope into the kept space, toward the chairs, toward the old men, toward the upright royal figure beyond. And the statue moved. I have spent years trying to find words for how fast it was and how controlled, and I have never quite managed it because the two things should not go together. Fast and controlled. Violence is supposed to be wild. What I saw was the opposite of wild. It was the fastest thing I have ever seen a human body do, and it was not wild at all. It was exact, every part of it bent to a single purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing flung, like a door that has been held shut against a great pressure for a long time and then, in the one instant it is meant to, opens. The guardsman came off his post. He did not shout. To this day that is the detail that stays with me most, that in all of it he never once raised his voice, never gave the crowd a sound to panic at. He simply ceased between one breath and the next to be a statue, and crossed the distance between his post and the man faster than I could turn my head to follow. The rifle came up across his body, not to fire, never to fire, but as a bar, a length of steel and wood held crosswise in two white-gloved hands, and he met the man at the rope at the very instant. The man's hand cleared his coat, and he drove him back and down and away from the chairs with the whole weight and discipline of his body behind that grounded, level bar of the rifle. It was over in perhaps 3 seconds. The man went down onto the stone hard, and the guardsman was over him, the rifle pinning, one knee down. And from the gate towers and the edges of the forecourt other men in scarlet were already converging, running now, because the first man had given them the thing they needed, which was certainty. And behind them came men in plainer clothes, the watchers you never see at such ceremonies until the one moment they are needed. And the man in the dark coat disappeared under all of them. And whatever he had carried was taken from his hand and away, and it was done. And the crowd, 10,000 of us, had barely begun to understand that anything had happened at all. There was a sound, a great indrawn breath, a rising murmur of alarm, heads turning, a few cries, but there was no panic. There was no stampede. Because the thing had been done so quickly, and so quietly, and so completely, in the space of 3 seconds and without a single shout, that by the time the crowd's fear could gather itself into something dangerous, the danger was already on the ground with 5 men on top of it, and there was nothing left to be afraid of. The guardsman's restraint, the long, terrible patience that had so frightened me when I did not understand it, had bought exactly this, that when he finally moved, he moved once, and rightly, and the moving was over before fear could turn the square into a second disaster. I was on my knees beside my grandfather's chair. I do not remember getting there. I had my arms around the old man, over his shoulders, shielding him with my own body in the useless way you do when the danger is already past, and he was alive and unhurt, and I could feel his heart going hard and fast under the worn green coat, and his trembling hands had come up and gripped my forearm with a strength I did not know he still had. The royal party had been hurried back through the door in the tower. The forecourt was filling with men now, scarlet and plain, moving with purpose, clearing a space, lifting the chairs of the veterans gently back and away. An officer was speaking to the crowd over some system, his voice calm and even, telling us that all was well, that there was no further danger, that we should remain where we were, and the calm of his voice did more to settle the square than any number of soldiers could have. And in the middle of it, the guardsman stood up. He stood up off the man who was being carried away now by others, and he stepped back, and he straightened his coat with 2 tugs of his white-gloved hands, and he settled the rifle, and for a moment he simply stood there in the cleared space, breathing, and I saw his face fully for the first time. He was younger than I had thought. Not young, but younger, perhaps 40 himself, with a hard, plain face and gray coming into the close-cropped hair beneath the bearskin, and a soldier's eyes, the kind that have seen the thing they were watching for many times before and were not surprised to see it again. There was no triumph in his face. There was no fear in it either, now that it was over. There was only a kind of weariness, and underneath the weariness, the same level steadiness that had held him still for an hour, gathering itself again, because his work was not done, because the day was not over, because he was still on his post even now. And then he did the thing that I have carried with me ever since, the thing that is the real reason I am writing any of this down. He turned and he looked at my grandfather. I do not know how he knew. Perhaps he had seen the old man turn his head in those last minutes. Perhaps, in that strange, wordless language of men who have stood posts, he had felt the old soldier see the wrong thing at the same instant he had. Or perhaps it was only that the chairs had been pulled back, and my grandfather was the nearest of the veterans, the old man in the worn green coat of the guardsman's own regiment, sitting very straight in his chair with his grandson's arms around him. I do not know, but the guardsman looked at my grandfather, and something passed across that hard, plain face, and he understood what the old coat meant. He read the faded green and the worn brass and the metal ribbons that matched, in their fashion, his own. He saw that the man he had just shielded was one of his own, a guardsman of the King's Foot Guard from a war before his time, an old sergeant who had once stood the post he stood now. And the guardsman came to attention. He turned to face my grandfather fully, his boots together on the stone, his body straightening into that flawless line, and he brought his white-gloved hand up in a salute. A slow one, a formal one, the full ceremonial salute of one soldier of the king's foot guard to another, held in the cold, bright air in the middle of the cleared and frightened forecourt, while men ran and an officer's calm voice rolled over the crowd. He did not have to do it. No regulation required it. It was not part of any ceremony anyone had planned. He did it because the old man in the chair was his brother across 50 years, because the thing he had just done was the thing my grandfather had once done, because there are debts between soldiers that have nothing to do with what either of them owes and everything to do with what they are. And my grandfather, Bram Castor, who could not climb the stairs of our house without resting twice, who had not been able to pin his own medals that morning without my help, who had sat in that chair for an hour with his trembling hands folded in his lap, let go of my arm. He put his hands on the arms of the chair and he pushed himself up. I tried to stop him. I had my hands on him. I told him to stay down. It was not over. He should not be standing. He ignored me completely. He did not even hear me, I think. He got his feet under him, and he rose, the old man, swaying, his whole body shaking now not with fear but with the effort of it. And he stood up out of that chair to his full height, which had once been the height of a guardsman of the line and was now bent and shrunken but still, for that one moment, straight. And he brought his own trembling, ruined, ancient hand up to the brim of an old cap he was not wearing, in the salute he had given 10,000 times in a war I was never told the name of, and he returned the young man's salute. The two of them held it, the young guardsman in his flawless scarlet at attention, his salute crisp and steady, the old veteran in his faded green, swaying, his salute trembling, held up by nothing but the will to hold it. Across perhaps 15 feet of pale stone, in the cold, with the whole frightened square moving around them, those two men stood and saluted each other and did not move. And for the length of a held breath the entire ceremony of the Day of the Fallen, the wreath and the bell and the names of the dead, came down to the two of them, the one who had stood the post in his time and the one who stood it now, honoring each other in the only way two such men ever truly can. Then it was over. The old man's strength gave out and I caught him as he came down and got him back into the chair, and the guardsman's hand came down from the salute, and an officer reached him and spoke low to him, and he turned and went back toward his post, back toward the gate, his work not finished, the day not done. He looked back once, I think. I am not sure. Memory rounds the edges of what was sharp, and I do not entirely trust the look back. It may be a thing I have added, a thing I wanted, but I remember it, so I will set it down and let you decide. They cleared us from the square soon after. The ceremony was not completed. There are things a kingdom cannot finish on a day that has been broken into. We were filed out gently, in long, calm lines, by men who had clearly done this before and meant to make sure that the fear which had not taken the square in the first 3 seconds did not take it now, in the leaving. I half carried my grandfather back the quarter-mile to the car. He was very quiet. He did not speak until we were nearly there, and then he said only one thing, and I have thought about it every day since. He said he held. That was all, he held. He did not mean the standing. He did not mean the hour of stillness, though he meant that too. He meant the whole of it. He meant the discipline that does not act until acting is right and then acts once completely and is done. He meant the thing he had spent his own life learning and that he had recognized instantly in a younger man across a cold square. The thing that the rest of us, the comfortable and the untested, look at and call a statue, an ornament, an absurdity, a relic, because we have never once in our soft lives had to be the one who held. I drove him home. I helped him out of his old coat and hung it up. I took the medals he could not unpin himself and set them in their case. He went to bed early, exhausted in a way that frightened me, and I sat up a long time in the dark of his front room, looking at the glass case by the door, at the worn brass and the faded green, and I thought about the young man in scarlet who had stood for an hour seeing the thing the rest of us could not, and had waited until the one right instant, and had then crossed the cold stone faster than I could turn my head. and had shielded an old soldier he had never met with a length of steel and his own disciplined body, and had not once raised his voice. I thought about how I had looked at him at the start of that afternoon and felt, in my heart, very slightly contemptuous of him. I have never told anyone that part until now. It is the part I am most ashamed of, and so it is the part that matters most to set down, because the shame is the thing that taught me. We look at the still man and we think he is doing nothing. We look at the disciplined man and we think discipline is the easy choice, the small choice, the choice of a man with no fire in him. We are wrong, and we are wrong in a way that can get people killed, because the still man is very often the only one in the whole loud, frightened crowd who is actually awake, and the disciplined man is the only one who can be trusted to move at the right moment instead of the wrong one. The fire we admire, the shouting and the charging and the acting now, is the cheap thing. The holding is the costly thing. I did not know that on the morning of the day of the fallen. I knew it by the evening, and I have known it ever since. My grandfather lived another 4 years. He went back to Castlewood for the day of the fallen each of them, and I took him each time, and I never again stood at the edge of that square and felt anything but a deep and quiet respect for the scarlet figures at the gate. I do not know whether the man who saved him stood the post again on those later days. The bearskin and the chin strap in the distance make it hard to know one guardsman from another, which I have come to understand is partly the point. They are meant to be a single unbroken wall of discipline, not a row of individual men. But I looked each year at the post by the right-hand tower, and I told myself that the man at it, whoever he was the same kind of man, and that was enough. I never learned his name with certainty. There was a notice, weeks later, brief and dry, that a guardsman of the King's Foot Guard had been recognized for his conduct on the day of the fallen, and a name was given, and I have chosen not to write it here, partly because I cannot be entirely sure it was his, and partly because I think he would not want it. Men like him do not stand the post to have their names written down. They stand it so that old men in faded coats can come, one cold autumn after another, while there are fewer of them each year, and honor their dead in safety and go home again. My grandfather is gone now too. His coat is in the glass case by my own door. My son asked me, not long ago, why we keep it, and why the old man went back every year to that cold square, and that is why I have written all of this down, so that he will have it when he is old enough to understand it, in the sharp and not the rounded version. I want him to know that there was a man in scarlet who stood without moving while a younger me decided he was an ornament. That the man saw what no one else saw, and held what no one else could have held, and waited through the longest minutes of his life because moving too soon would have been its own kind of failure. That when the moment came, he moved once and rightly, and saved my grandfather and a great many others, and never raised his voice. And that afterward, with the square still frightened around him and his own work not yet done, he turned and gave an old broken soldier a salute he did not have to give, and an old broken soldier rose up out of his chair on legs that could barely hold him to return it. That is what the stillness is for. That is what the discipline is for. Not for show, not for the tourists and their photographs. For the one afternoon in 1,000 when everything depends on a man who has trained his whole life to do nothing until he must, and then to do the right thing completely and to ask for nothing in return. He held. My grandfather said it in the car in 4 words with the whole of his own life behind them, and I have never found a better way to say it, so I will end with his. He held.